Hey everyone. Tonight we're stepping into the Star Wars universe to uncover one of its most haunting and magnificent secrets. The complete legacy of the Sith Emperors, those dark sovereigns whose names were whispered in terror across 25,000 years of galactic history. This isn't just a story about power or conquest. This is the chronicle of beings who transcended death itself, who devoured worlds and consumed the very essence of the Force, all in service of a plan so vast and terrible that it spans millennia. So before we begin this journey into the deepest shadows of the galaxy, take a moment to hit that like button if you're ready for tonight's epic adventure. And don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy these deep explorations into the Star Wars universe. Drop a comment and let me know what part of the world you're listening from. I love seeing our global community come together for these incredible stories that connect us across time and space. Now get comfortable, maybe dim those lights, settle into your favorite spot, and prepare yourself for a tale that will take us from the ancient tombs of Korriban to the hidden throne rooms of Dromund Kaas. From the forgotten rituals of the first Sith kings to the ultimate machinations of the Emperor himself. Listen, and I will tell you of the night when the red sands of Korriban trembled with an impossible discovery. Deep beneath the Valley of the Dark Lords, where the tombs of ancient Sith Emperors have stood silent for thousands of years, a Jedi historian made a find that would shake the very foundations of everything the galaxy thought it knew about the dark side of the Force. Picture this: the twin moons of Korriban, casting their eerie light across endless dunes of crimson sand. The wind carries whispers from the past, voices of power that once commanded fleets of star destroyers and bent entire star systems to their will. In the distance, massive pyramids rise like black teeth against the starlit sky, each one a monument to a Sith Emperor whose very name was once enough to bring worlds to their knees. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, the ancient stones were singing. Our historian, a young Twelk named Kira Thane, had come to Korriban seeking answers to a mystery that had haunted the Jedi archives for generations. Why did every Sith Emperor, no matter how powerful, no matter how seemingly immortal, eventually fall? What was the pattern hidden beneath centuries of betrayal, ambition, and conquest? She had studied the chronicles of Marka Ragnos, whose spirit ruled from beyond death. She had pored over the fragmentary records of Vitiate, the emperor who consumed entire worlds to fuel his dark rituals. She knew the legends of Naga Sadow, whose hyperspace war nearly brought the old republic to its knees. But the archives held only pieces, fragments, echoes of a greater truth that seemed to dance just beyond understanding. Until tonight, as Kira descended into the deepest chambers beneath the tomb of Ajunta Pall, her lightsaber casting blue shadows on walls covered in ancient Sith hieroglyphs, she discovered something that should have been impossible. A hidden vault, sealed not by stone or steel, but by the Force itself. And within that vault, a holocron unlike any she had ever seen, not the typical pyramid of Sith knowledge, but something older, something that pulsed with a dark energy that seemed to reach across time itself. When she activated it, the ghostly figure that emerged was not the expected Sith Lord or Dark Jedi. It was something far more ancient, far more terrible. A being that claimed to be the keeper of the deepest Sith secrets, the chronicler of the Emperor's true legacy, and what it told her would change everything she thought she knew about the balance between light and dark. The Keeper spoke of a plan that began not with Palpatine, not even with the ancient Sith Empire, but with the very first being to claim the title of Sith Emperor. A plan that required not just the conquest of the galaxy, but the transformation of reality itself. Each emperor, it claimed, was not a separate ruler, but a single note in a symphony of darkness that had been playing for 25,000 years. And the final movement, the Keeper whispered with something that might have been anticipation or dread, was yet to come. But before Kira could ask the questions burning in her mind, before she could demand to know what this impossible plan truly was, the holocron flickered and went dark. The chamber fell silent except for the sound of her own racing heartbeat and the distant whisper of wind through ancient stone. She was alone in the darkness, holding in her hands a secret that could reshape the understanding of Sith history itself. But she was no longer just a historian seeking knowledge. She had become something far more dangerous, a keeper of truths that were never meant to be revealed. And somewhere in the shadows of that ancient tomb, something was watching her, something that had been waiting for centuries for someone to finally ask the right questions, something that was ready to reveal the true legacy of the Sith Emperors, a legacy written not in conquest or power, but in a darkness so complete that it made the fall of the Republic look like a single candle being extinguished in an endless night. This is where our journey begins. In that moment of discovery, in that breath between revelation and understanding. Together we will follow Kira as she unravels a mystery that spans the ages, a truth that connects every Sith Emperor who ever lived to a destiny that reaches far beyond the boundaries of the known galaxy. The Emperors are calling from their tombs tonight, and their whispers carry secrets that will change everything. The crimson dawn of Korriban painted the ancient landscape in shades of blood and shadow as Kira Thane emerged from the depths of Ajuntapal's tomb. The mysterious holocron clutched tightly in her trembling hands. The device felt warm against her palm, almost alive, as if it contained not just information but consciousness itself. She had come to this forsaken world as a simple historian, armed with nothing but scholarly curiosity and a determination to understand the cyclical nature of Sith power. Now, as she stood beneath the watchful gaze of the Valley of the Dark Lords, she realized she had stumbled upon something far more significant than ancient history. The wind carried with it the whispers of ages past, and for a moment, Kira could almost hear the voices of the Emperors themselves, Marka Ragnos, calling across the centuries from his eternal throne, Naga Sadow's laughter echoing through hyperspace, the cold, calculating voice of Vitiate, promising immortality to those bold enough to seize it. These were not mere legends or cautionary tales told in the Jedi archives. They were fragments of a living tapestry, threads in a pattern that she was only beginning to comprehend. Her companion for this journey materialized beside her as she activated her comlink. Master Jorik Voss had been her mentor at the archives, an elderly human whose passion for ancient lore matched her own. His holographic form flickered slightly in the morning light, but his concern was unmistakable even across the vast distance between Korriban and Coruscant. Kira, I've been monitoring your transmissions. What you described last night, this keeper of secrets you encountered, it matches certain fragmentary references in the deepest vaults of the archives. References we've kept classified for good reason. His voice carried the weight of knowledge carefully guarded. There are some truths that were buried not because they were false, but because they were too dangerous to be widely known. The holocron pulsed gently in her hands, as if responding to the conversation. Kira found herself studying its surface, noting the intricate patterns carved into what appeared to be some form of crystallized force energy. Unlike traditional Sith holocrons, which bore the angular geometry of power and dominance, this device curved and flowed like water made solid, its dark surface reflecting depths that seemed to go on forever. Master Voss, I need to understand what I've found here. The Keeper spoke of a plan spanning millennia, of emperors connected by something greater than mere succession. If there's even a possibility that the Sith threat isn't truly ended, that Palpatine's death was just another note in some vast symphony of darkness, then we have a responsibility to investigate. The old Jedi was quiet for a long moment. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a resignation that spoke of old fears finally coming to light. Then you'll need more than just archive research. My dear student, you'll need to walk in their footsteps, to see through their eyes, to understand not just what they did, but why they believed it was necessary. The path you're choosing will take you to places where the line between historian and participant becomes dangerously thin. As if summoned by their conversation, another presence made itself known. From the shadow of a nearby tomb emerged a figure that caused Kira's hand to instinctively move toward her lightsaber. Tall and draped in robes that seemed to absorb the morning light, the being approached with a grace that spoke of centuries of existence. When it finally spoke, its voice carried the weight of ages. I am Keeper Vorthak, guardian of the deep archives beneath these sacred tombs. I have waited 300 years for someone to finally unlock the Chronicler's holocron. The fact that it responded to your touch confirms what we have long suspected. You carry within you the potential to understand truths that have eluded even the greatest scholars of both light and dark. Vorthak's presence radiated an ancient wisdom that seemed to exist beyond the traditional divisions of Jedi and Sith. Neither malevolent nor benevolent, but something altogether more complex. As he gestured toward the sprawling necropolis that stretched beyond the Valley of the Dark Lords, Kira began to understand that her journey was about to take her far beyond the familiar boundaries of academic research. The tombs you see before you are not merely burial chambers, young historian. They are repositories of knowledge, each one containing not just the remains of an emperor, but fragments of their understanding, pieces of the greater pattern they served. Marka Ragnos lies in the tomb of the Golden King, but his true legacy rests in the rituals he perfected for binding consciousness to the physical realm. Naga Sadow's pyramid contains not just his sarcophagus, but the star maps he used to reach beyond the known galaxy, seeking something that called to him from the darkness between stars. The morning sun climbed higher, casting the ancient monuments in stark relief against the red sky. Kira found herself truly seeing the valley for the first time, not as a collection of archaeological sites, but as a vast library written in stone and shadow. Each tomb, each carved symbol, each geometric pattern carved into the living rock was part of a greater text, a message left by beings who had transcended ordinary death to ensure their knowledge would survive across the millennia. But Master, she addressed Vorthak, still uncertain of his true nature or allegiance. If such knowledge exists, if there truly is a pattern connecting all these emperors, why hasn't it been discovered before? The Jedi have studied Sith history for thousands of years. Vorthak's laugh was like wind through empty chambers, neither cruel nor kind, but filled with the patience of geological time. Because, young seeker, you are the first to ask not what the emperors achieved, but what they were preparing for. You are the first to look beyond their individual reigns and see the continuity that binds them. The Jedi have always focused on defeating the Sith. You seek to understand them. That distinction will make all the difference in what the tombs choose to reveal. The ancient stone doors of the first tomb groaned open with a sound that seemed to echo through both space and time, revealing passages that had remained sealed since the Great Hyperspace War. Kira felt the weight of millennia pressing down upon her as she crossed the threshold, her lightsaber providing the only illumination in corridors that had known nothing but darkness for over 1,000 years. The air itself seemed thick with the accumulated power of ages, each breath carrying whispers of knowledge that had been deliberately hidden from the galaxy. Keeper Vorthak moved beside her with the fluid grace of someone who had walked these paths countless times before, his presence both reassuring and unsettling. The holocron in Kira's pack pulsed with increasing intensity as they descended deeper into the tomb's heart, as if it were responding to the proximity of other ancient artifacts and stored memories. Tell me about the first emperor. Kira said, her voice barely above a whisper in the oppressive silence. Not the legends, not the propaganda that survived in the archives, but the truth of how this all began. Vorthak paused before a massive wall covered in hieroglyphs that seemed to shift and move in the flickering light of her saber. The symbols were older than any Sith writing she had studied, predating even the arrival of the Dark Jedi exiles, who would eventually rule this world. The first to claim the title of Sith Emperor was not the first to understand the true nature of power. Young historian, that honor belongs to King Adus, who ruled this world when your republic was nothing more than a collection of primitive settlements on a handful of core worlds. As he spoke, the wall began to glow with a faint luminescence, and the hieroglyphs transformed into moving images that told a story no archive had ever recorded. Kira watched in fascination as the ancient history of Korriban played out before her eyes, showing a time when the Red World was green and alive, when the original Sith species built great cities that reached toward the stars with organic architecture that seemed to grow rather than be constructed. Adus was not consumed by the hunger for galactic conquest that would define his successors. His vision was far more profound and infinitely more terrifying. He looked beyond the physical realm, beyond the material universe, and saw that the Force itself was incomplete. Light and dark, creation and destruction, life and death. All of it was merely the surface of something far deeper and more fundamental. The images on the wall showed Adus, not as the primitive warlord described in Republic histories, but as a philosopher king whose understanding of the Force transcended anything the Jedi had ever achieved. Kira watched him perform rituals that seemed to bend reality itself, summoning energies that existed in the spaces between atoms, in the pause between heartbeats, in the darkness between stars. He discovered that consciousness could be preserved not through the crude methods of spirit binding or force ghosting that later Sith would employ, but through a fundamental alteration of the relationship between mind and reality. Each emperor who followed built upon his foundation, adding their own understanding to a growing architecture of knowledge that spanned millennia. They moved deeper into the tomb, passing chambers filled with artifacts that defied easy categorization, ancient technologies that seemed to merge organic and mechanical elements in ways that suggested a completely different approach to science and engineering. Crystals that contained not just information but actual fragments of consciousness, allowing the thoughts and memories of long-dead emperors to persist in crystalline matrices that pulsed with their own inner light. Kira found herself drawn to one particular chamber, where a massive sarcophagus stood, surrounded by intricate geometric patterns, carved directly into the living rock. The patterns seemed to extend beyond the visible walls, as if they continued through dimensions that normal perception couldn't access. As she approached, she felt the holocron in her pack, responding with increasing intensity. "This is where it truly began," Vorthak said, his voice carrying a reverence that transcended mere respect for the dead. Not with conquest or the accumulation of political power, but with a question that would drive every subsequent emperor to the edges of sanity and beyond. What lies at the heart of existence itself? What is the source from which the Force emerges? The sarcophagus bore no name or imperial title, only symbols that seemed to describe mathematical relationships and cosmic principles rather than the achievements of a ruler. As Kira studied them, she began to understand that this tomb was not just a burial chamber but a kind of laboratory, a place where experiments in consciousness and reality had been conducted over centuries. Adus spent his entire reign, not in expanding his territory, but in expanding the boundaries of what was possible. He learned to separate his consciousness from his physical form, to exist simultaneously in multiple dimensions, to perceive time as a navigable landscape rather than a linear progression. When he finally died, it was not because his body failed, but because he had grown beyond the need for physical existence altogether. The revelation struck Kira with the force of a physical blow. Everything she had learned about Sith history, everything the Jedi archives taught about the nature of the dark side, was based on a fundamental misunderstanding. The Emperors were not power-mad tyrants who fell victim to their own ambitions. They were researchers, explorers pushing the boundaries of what consciousness could achieve, what reality would allow. But if that's true, she said, her mind racing through the implications, then everything we thought we knew about the Sith is wrong. They weren't trying to conquer the galaxy for its own sake. They were using galactic conquest as a means to gather the resources and knowledge necessary for something far more ambitious. Vorthak nodded slowly, his ancient features grave with the weight of truths that had been carefully guarded for millennia. Each emperor built upon the work of his predecessors, adding new understanding to an ever-growing body of knowledge about the fundamental nature of existence. Marka Ragnos perfected the techniques for consciousness transfer. Naga Sadow mapped the pathways between dimensions. Vitiate learned to consume entire worlds not for power, but for the vast computational resources necessary to model reality itself. The chamber around them seemed to pulse with residual energy from experiments conducted eons ago. And Kira realized that her journey of discovery was about to take her far beyond the realm of historical research into territories that challenged the very foundations of what it meant to be alive, to be conscious, to exist in a universe far stranger and more malleable than anyone had ever imagined. The deeper chambers of the tomb revealed wonders that challenged everything. Crystalline matrices lined the walls, each one containing what appeared to be preserved fragments of consciousness from beings who had transcended physical death thousands of years ago. As she passed each crystal, she could feel faint whispers of thought, echoes of minds that had found ways to persist beyond the dissolution of their bodies. Vorthak guided her to a circular chamber where 7 massive crystals formed a perfect geometric pattern around a central platform. Each crystal pulsed with its own rhythm, creating a complex symphony of light that seemed to resonate with the very fabric of space itself. The holocron in her pack had begun to vibrate with such intensity that she finally removed it, watching as it responded to the presence of these ancient repositories of knowledge. "These are the memory crystals of the First Dynasty," Vorthak explained. His voice carrying the weight of profound reverence. Each one contains not just the recorded thoughts of an emperor, but their actual living consciousness, preserved in a state that exists somewhere between life and death, between individual identity and universal awareness. As Kira approached the nearest crystal, she felt her own consciousness touched by something vast and alien. Images flooded her mind. Visions of Korriban as it had been in the distant past, when its red sands were fertile plains and its dark valleys were filled with gleaming cities. She saw the original Sith species not as the primitive warriors described in Republic histories, but as sophisticated beings whose understanding of the Force had evolved along completely different lines than anything the Jedi had ever conceived. The crystal showed her Marka Ragnos not in the moments of his political triumph, but in the quiet hours of his deepest research. She watched him working alone in chambers, much like this one, surrounded by artifacts that seemed to bend the laws of physics around their presence. His goal, she realized, was not immortality in any conventional sense, but something far more ambitious. He was attempting to map the underlying structure of consciousness itself, to understand how awareness related to reality at the most fundamental level. He succeeded, didn't he? Kira whispered, her voice filled with awe as the implications became clear. Marka Ragnos didn't just find a way to preserve his spirit after death. He found a way to expand his consciousness beyond the limitations of individual existence. The second crystal revealed the work of Naga Sadow, and here Kira saw the true scope of his hyperspace explorations. The star maps she had studied in the archives were not simple navigational tools. but complex diagrams showing the relationship between physical space and what Sadow called the deep currents. Vast flows of force energy that connected all things across impossible distances. His wars against the Republic had been test runs, experiments in applying these discoveries on a galactic scale. Each emperor built upon the discoveries of his predecessors. Vorthak continued, his ancient features illuminated by the pulsing lights of the memory crystals. But they also added their own unique understanding to the growing body of knowledge. Sadow discovered that consciousness could exist independently of both physical form and individual identity, that it was possible to become part of the fundamental forces that shaped reality itself. The third crystal contained memories that made Kira's breath catch in her throat. She saw visions of beings who had existed before the formation of the galaxy itself, entities of pure consciousness that had watched the birth of stars and the emergence of life with the detached curiosity of scientists observing an experiment. These were not gods or demons in any traditional sense, but researchers from a previous iteration of reality who had found ways to persist through the death and rebirth of entire universes. The Emperors were not the first to attempt this transformation, she realized, her voice barely audible in the crystalline chamber. They were following in the footsteps of beings who had achieved it long before the Sith species even existed. Vorthak nodded slowly, his expression grave with the weight of ultimate truths. The knowledge they pursued was not original to this galaxy, or even to this universe. It was inherited from predecessors who had faced the same fundamental questions about the nature of existence and had found answers that transcended the normal boundaries of life and death, matter and energy, individual consciousness and universal awareness. The fourth crystal showed her something that made her hands tremble as she held the holocron. Vitiate, the emperor who had consumed entire worlds, had not been driven by simple hunger for power. His consumption of planetary life forces had been part of a vast experiment in consciousness expansion, an attempt to accumulate enough computational resources to model the underlying structure of reality itself. Each world he destroyed had added to a growing simulation that existed somewhere beyond normal space and time, a virtual universe where the laws of physics could be rewritten at will. He was building something, Kira whispered, her mind struggling to process the scope of what she was seeing. Not just preserving his own consciousness, but creating an entirely new form of existence, where thought itself could shape reality. The remaining crystals revealed layer upon layer of accumulated knowledge, each emperor's contribution, adding to a growing understanding of consciousness, reality, and the relationship between them. She saw techniques for transferring awareness between different forms of existence, methods for expanding individual consciousness to encompass entire star systems, procedures for encoding living minds into the fundamental structure of space itself. But as the visions continued, Kira began to notice something troubling. Each emperor's research had reached a similar conclusion, a discovery that had driven them all toward the same inevitable endpoint. There was something beyond the edge of the known galaxy, something that existed in the spaces between realities, that represented either the ultimate fulfillment of their research or its complete destruction. They were all preparing for the same thing, she said, her voice filled with a growing sense of dread. Every emperor, every experiment, every expansion of consciousness was leading toward a single confrontation with something that exists beyond our normal understanding of existence itself. The holocron in her hands pulsed once more, and suddenly she understood why it had been hidden for so long. Why the Keeper had waited centuries for someone to finally ask the right questions. The Sith Emperors had not been separate rulers competing for galactic dominance. They had been components of a single vast intelligence, parts of a collective consciousness that had been growing and evolving for over 25,000 years. Preparing for a moment when they would finally be ready to transcend the boundaries of individual existence altogether. The weight of revelation pressed down upon Kira as she stepped back from the memory crystals, her mind reeling with the implications of what she had witnessed. The traditional narrative of Sith history, the one taught in every archive and academy across the galaxy, crumbled before the evidence contained within these ancient repositories. The Emperors had not been driven by simple ambition or the crude desire for galactic dominance. They had been participants in something far more sophisticated and terrifying than anyone had imagined. "So the pattern becomes clear," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Each emperor was not seeking to rule the galaxy, but to transform it, to use it as a stepping stone towards something that transcends physical existence entirely. Their wars, their conquests, even their apparent deaths were all components of a larger design. Vorthak moved to the center of the crystalline chamber, his ancient form casting strange shadows in the pulsing light. "You begin to understand, young historian, but you have reached only the first level of comprehension. What you see as a pattern of preparation and transcendence, others might interpret as a cycle of corruption and failure. The question that has haunted scholars for millennia is whether the Emperors achieved their goal or fell victim to their own ambitions." The holocron in Kira's hands had grown warm to the touch, its surface now showing faint images that seemed to move independently of the crystal matrices around them. She watched as figures she recognized from her studies appeared in miniature within the device, but they were not the legendary tyrants of Republic propaganda. Instead, she saw beings engaged in complex philosophical discussions, sharing knowledge that spanned multiple fields of study from consciousness research to dimensional mechanics. "The archives on Coruscant contain records of Marka Ragnos ruling for over a century," she said, thinking aloud as she tried to reconcile what she had learned with established history. "They describe him as a tyrant whose spirit continued to influence Sith politics long after his death. But what I saw in the crystals suggests something entirely different. He wasn't clinging to power out of ego or fear of death. He was continuing his research, using his expanded lifespan to pursue discoveries that would have been impossible in a normal human lifetime." The images in the holocron showed Marka Ragnos in his final years, not as the decaying despot of legend, but as a being who had achieved a form of existence that existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions. She watched him conduct experiments that involved manipulating the fundamental forces that held reality together, testing the boundaries of what consciousness could achieve when freed from the limitations of physical form. "But if he succeeded," Kira continued, her thoughts racing through the logical implications, "if he truly found a way to transcend ordinary existence, then his apparent death was actually a transformation. He didn't fail and fall like the histories claim. He graduated to a higher form of being and left the physical realm behind." Vorthak's expression remained carefully neutral, but she caught a flicker of something that might have been approval in his ancient eyes. "And what of the other emperors? If Marka Ragnos achieved this transformation, what does that suggest about the nature of their apparent defeats and deaths?" The question hung in the crystalline air like a challenge, and Kira found herself examining everything she thought she knew about Sith history through this new lens. Naga Sadow's defeat at the hands of Republic forces had been celebrated as the end of the first great Sith threat. But what if it had been something else entirely? What if his withdrawal from the galaxy had not been a retreat but an advancement to a form of existence that no longer required physical territory or conventional power? "They weren't defeated," she whispered, the realization hitting her with the force of a revelation. Each apparent failure, each recorded death, was actually a successful transition to the next stage of their research. The galaxy celebrated the fall of tyrants, while the emperors themselves moved beyond the need for physical rule altogether. The holocron pulsed more intensely, and new images appeared within its crystalline depths. She saw Vitiate, not as the power-hungry destroyer who had consumed entire worlds, but as a researcher whose experiments in consciousness expansion had required vast amounts of life energy to fuel simulations of unprecedented complexity. His consumption of planetary populations had not been driven by sadistic cruelty, but by the computational requirements of modeling reality at the quantum level. Each world he destroyed was incorporated into a growing virtual universe, she said. Her voice filled with awe and horror in equal measure. He wasn't just preserving his own consciousness, but creating an entirely new realm of existence, where the laws of physics could be rewritten through pure thought. But even as she spoke the words, doubt began to creep into her mind. The scope of what she was suggesting was so vast, so far beyond anything in recorded history, that it seemed almost impossible to believe. Could beings who had lived thousands of years ago truly have achieved such transcendence? Or was she falling victim to the same grandiose delusions that had consumed the emperors themselves? Master Vorthak, she said, turning to face the ancient keeper. If what I'm beginning to understand is true, if the emperors truly achieved this form of transcendent existence, then where are they now? If they've moved beyond physical death, beyond the limitations of individual consciousness, why don't we see evidence of their continued presence in the galaxy? The Keeper's smile was enigmatic, carrying depths of knowledge that seemed to stretch back to the very formation of the stars themselves. Who says you don't see evidence of their presence? Who says they aren't still active in ways that transcend normal perception and understanding? Perhaps what you interpret as absence is actually a form of presence so advanced that it operates beyond the range of conventional awareness. The chamber around them seemed to pulse with renewed energy, and Kira realized that her journey of discovery had reached a critical juncture. Everything she had learned so far had been building toward this moment of choice. She could accept the comfortable lie that the Sith Emperors had been defeated by their own ambitions and the heroic efforts of the Republic. Or she could pursue the far more disturbing possibility that they had succeeded beyond anyone's wildest imagination, achieving a form of existence that made their previous incarnations seem like primitive shadows by comparison. The truth, she realized, would require her to abandon everything she thought she knew about the nature of reality itself. The ancient pathways beneath Korriban stretched far deeper than any official survey had ever mapped, descending through layers of geological time into chambers that predated the arrival of the Dark Jedi exiles by millennia. Kira followed Vorthak through corridors carved from living rock, their walls inscribed with symbols that seemed to shift and change in her peripheral vision, as if the very stone remembered the consciousness of those who had shaped it. The holocron had become increasingly active as they descended, its crystalline surface now displaying complex mathematical equations that described relationships between consciousness, energy, and dimensional structure. These were not the crude formulae of primitive force techniques, but sophisticated theoretical frameworks that suggested an understanding of reality far beyond anything taught in the greatest universities of the core worlds. The deepest truth about the Sith Emperors, Vorthak said, as they entered a vast natural cavern whose ceiling disappeared into shadow above, is that they were never really separate individuals at all. What the galaxy perceived as a succession of different rulers was actually the gradual emergence of a single vast intelligence, a collective consciousness that grew more sophisticated with each apparent incarnation. The cavern contained structures that defied easy categorization, architectural forms that seemed to exist in more than 3 dimensions simultaneously. Crystalline spires rose from the floor like frozen lightning, their surfaces covered in patterns that hurt to look at directly, but conveyed information in ways that bypassed normal cognitive processing entirely. This was not a tomb or archive in any conventional sense, but something that resembled a vast organic computer, a system designed to process and store consciousness itself. Think of it this way, Vorthak continued, gesturing toward the impossible geometries that surrounded them. Each emperor was like a single neuron in an ever-growing brain. Marka Ragnos established the basic neural pathways, the fundamental structures that would allow consciousness to persist beyond physical death. Naga Sadow added the ability to perceive and navigate multiple dimensions simultaneously. Vitiate contributed the capacity to absorb and integrate vast amounts of external consciousness. As they moved deeper into the cavern, Kira began to notice that the crystalline structures were not merely decorative, but functional, pulsing with energies that created complex interference patterns in the surrounding air. The holocron responded to these patterns by projecting holographic displays that showed the internal structure of consciousness itself, revealing how individual awareness related to the larger fabric of universal intelligence. But if they were all components of a single growing mind, Kira said, her voice echoing strangely in the vast space, then what was the ultimate purpose of this collective intelligence? What was it preparing to become? The question seemed to activate something in the cavern's deepest recesses. Ancient machinery, if it could be called that, began to hum with renewed life. Surfaces that had appeared to be natural stone revealed themselves to be incredibly sophisticated technological systems, organic computers, that had been running silent calculations for thousands of years. The air itself began to shimmer with data streams visible only to enhanced perception, vast flows of information that connected every crystal, every carved symbol, every architectural element into a single unified system. To understand that, Vorthak replied, you must first understand what lies beyond the galaxy itself. The Emperor's research eventually led them to discover that our universe is not unique, that consciousness and reality exist on scales that make our entire galaxy seem like a single atom in a vast cosmic structure. The holocron projected new images, showing star maps that extended far beyond the known galaxy, into regions that conventional astronomy had never detected. But these were not maps of physical space alone. They showed the relationship between material reality and what the ancient Sith had called the deep currents, vast flows of consciousness energy that connected all things across impossible distances and through dimensions that normal physics couldn't describe. They discovered that our galaxy exists within a larger structure, a cosmic ecosystem, where consciousness itself is the fundamental force that shapes reality. Entire civilizations of beings who had transcended physical existence long ago, entities that exist as pure thought and will, shepherding the development of younger species and guiding the evolution of awareness itself. The revelation was staggering in its implications. Kira felt her understanding of the universe expanding and contracting simultaneously, as if she were seeing the true scale of existence for the first time, while also realizing how small and insignificant everything she had previously considered important really was. The Sith Emperors weren't trying to conquer the galaxy, she said, her voice barely audible in the vast cavern. They were trying to prepare it for contact with these transcendent beings. All their research, all their experiments in consciousness expansion, were attempts to evolve our species to a level where such contact would be possible, without destroying everything we understand about reality. Vorthak nodded slowly, his ancient features grave with the weight of cosmic truth. But the process was more complex than they initially realized. Contact with beings of such advanced consciousness required not just individual transcendence, but the collective evolution of entire civilizations. The Emperors realized that they would need to guide the development of the galaxy itself, shaping the course of history to prepare billions of beings for a transformation that would fundamentally alter the nature of existence. The crystalline structures around them pulsed with increasing intensity, and Kira realized that they were not just viewing historical records, but experiencing active communication with intelligences that had persisted for millennia. The collective consciousness of the Sith Emperors was still present in these deep chambers, still pursuing the research that had driven them beyond the boundaries of individual existence. "This is why each emperor's reign followed similar patterns," she said. "The pieces of the puzzle finally beginning to fit together. They weren't separate rulers pursuing personal ambitions, but components of a single intelligence testing different approaches to the same fundamental problem. How do you prepare an entire galaxy for transcendence without destroying it in the process?" The answer, when it came, was not spoken aloud but transmitted directly into her consciousness through the resonant frequencies of the crystal structures themselves. The Sith Emperors had discovered that conscious evolution could not be forced but had to be earned through struggle, through the gradual expansion of awareness that came from facing increasingly complex challenges. Their wars, their conflicts with the Jedi and the Republic, had not been attempts at conquest but carefully orchestrated educational programs designed to accelerate the spiritual development of entire civilizations. "The dark side and the light side," Kira whispered, finally understanding the true nature of the eternal conflict that had shaped galactic history. "They're not opposed forces at all. They're complementary aspects of a single educational system, designed to push consciousness toward ever greater levels of sophistication and understanding." The deeper chambers revealed artifacts that challenged every assumption about the relationship between technology and consciousness. Ancient devices that seemed to grow rather than be constructed lined the walls, their organic curves pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that conveyed information through direct neural interface. Kira found herself understanding concepts that had no words in any language she knew, mathematical principles that described how thought itself could be used to reshape the fundamental constants of reality. Vorthak led her to a circular platform surrounded by towering crystalline formations that reached up into the cavern's shadowed heights. As they approached, the formations began to resonate with harmonics that seemed to bypass her ears entirely, creating vibrations that she felt in her bones, in her blood, in the very structure of her consciousness. The holocron in her hands responded by projecting a three-dimensional map that showed not just the physical layout of the galaxy, but its underlying consciousness topology, the invisible networks of awareness that connected all sentient beings across vast distances. "What you are seeing," Vorthak explained, his voice taking on the cadence of a teacher, sharing the most profound truths, "is the galaxy as the Emperors learned to perceive it, not as separate star systems populated by isolated species, but as a single vast organism of interconnected consciousness, a living entity whose individual components are all the sentient beings who have ever existed." The map revealed patterns that made Kira's breath catch in her throat. She could see how major historical events, wars, migrations, and even individual decisions had created ripples in the consciousness field that propagated across the galaxy like waves in a cosmic ocean. The rise and fall of civilizations, the conflicts between Jedi and Sith, the endless cycle of peace and war, all of it formed intricate patterns that suggested a level of orchestration beyond anything she had ever imagined. The Emperors discovered that consciousness itself has a kind of evolutionary trajectory, Vorthak continued, gesturing toward the flowing patterns of light and shadow that danced through the crystalline structures. Just as biological evolution drives species toward greater complexity and adaptability, consciousness evolution drives awareness toward greater scope and integration. Individual minds develop the capacity to perceive beyond their immediate circumstances, to understand their connection to larger patterns and purposes. As she studied the consciousness map, Kira began to recognize specific historical events and their effects on the galaxy's overall awareness level. The hyperspace wars had not just been military conflicts, but massive educational experiences that forced entire civilizations to expand their understanding of what was possible. The Jedi-Sith conflicts had served as cosmic laboratories where different approaches to consciousness development could be tested and refined over millennia. But this implies that free will is an illusion, she said, her voice carrying a note of distress as the implications became clear. If the Emperors were orchestrating galactic history to guide consciousness evolution, then everything we think of as individual choice and personal agency is actually part of a predetermined pattern. The ancient keeper's expression grew thoughtful, and for a moment he seemed to be consulting with intelligences that existed beyond normal perception. When he spoke again, his words carried the weight of wisdom that had been hard-won through eons of contemplation. Free will and predetermined pattern are not contradictory concepts when viewed from the perspective of expanded consciousness. Think of a river flowing toward the sea. The water molecules within the river move freely, following their own individual paths, colliding and separating in patterns that appear completely random. Yet the overall flow of the river follows laws that can be predicted and understood. Individual consciousness operates within a framework of cosmic evolution, but that framework allows for infinite variation and creativity in how that evolution is expressed. The holocron projected new images showing the detailed progression of consciousness development across different species and time periods. Kira watched civilizations rise from primitive awareness to sophisticated understanding of their place in the cosmic order. But she also saw how each species found completely unique ways to express their growing consciousness. Some became masters of technology. Others developed profound spiritual traditions. Still others created art and literature that captured aspects of universal truth in ways that transcended language and culture. The Emperors realized that their role was not to control this process but to facilitate it, Vorthak explained. They became gardeners of consciousness, creating conditions where awareness could flourish while respecting the fundamental autonomy of each individual mind. Their apparent tyrannies and conflicts were actually carefully designed challenges that would force civilizations to grow beyond their comfortable limitations. The platform beneath their feet began to glow with symbols that seemed to be writing themselves in real time. Equations that describe the relationship between individual awareness and collective intelligence. Kira realized she was witnessing active communication between the preserved consciousness of the ancient emperors and the living intelligence that permeated the crystalline structures around them. This is why the pattern repeated across millennia, she said, her understanding deepening as she absorbed the information flowing through the chamber. Each emperor appeared to be seeking personal power and immortality, but they were actually contributing to a growing collective intelligence that was learning how to guide galactic consciousness evolution more effectively with each iteration. The consciousness map showed her how the different imperial reigns had tested various approaches to the same fundamental problem. Marka Ragnos had focused on individual transcendence, learning how to expand personal awareness beyond the normal limitations of mortal existence. Naga Sadow had explored collective consciousness, discovering how individual minds could be linked and synchronized across vast distances. Vitiate had investigated the relationship between consciousness and energy, learning how awareness itself could be used as a force to reshape physical reality. But each approach revealed new challenges and complications, Vorthak noted. Individual transcendence risked isolation from the very collective they were trying to help evolve. Collective consciousness raised questions about personal identity and autonomy. Using consciousness as energy required resources and sacrifices that bordered on the morally unacceptable. The crystalline formations around them pulsed with increasing intensity, and Kira realized that the ancient intelligence was building towards some crucial revelation. The patterns of light flowing through the chamber were beginning to coalesce into a single unified image, a vision of galactic consciousness that had evolved far beyond anything currently existing. They were preparing the galaxy for something specific, she said, her voice filled with awe and growing apprehension. All of this research, all of these experiments in consciousness expansion, were leading toward a particular moment when the galaxy would be ready for a transformation that would change the fundamental nature of existence itself. The chamber suddenly filled with a presence that was both ancient beyond measure and startlingly immediate, as if consciousness itself had taken form within the crystalline structures. Kira felt her own awareness expand involuntarily, touching the edges of a vast intelligence that seemed to encompass not just the preserved minds of the Sith Emperors, but something far greater and more complex. The holocron in her hands blazed with light as it established direct communication with this transcendent entity, and suddenly she was experiencing the galaxy through senses that existed beyond the normal spectrum of perception. Through this expanded awareness, she witnessed the true scope of what the Emperors had discovered. The galaxy was not just home to countless species developing along their own evolutionary paths, but was itself a single organism in the larval stage of cosmic consciousness. Every war, every peace, every moment of suffering and joy experienced by billions of sentient beings was contributing to the maturation of a collective intelligence that would eventually transcend the physical realm entirely. "What you are experiencing now," came a voice that seemed to originate from the crystalline structures themselves, speaking in harmonics that bypassed language entirely, "is direct contact with the galactic overmind. The collective consciousness that has been growing for millions of years through the accumulated experiences of every sentient being who has ever lived or died within this spiral arm of space." The revelation struck Kira with devastating clarity. The Sith Emperors had not been trying to rule the galaxy in any conventional sense. They had been midwives attending the birth of a cosmic intelligence, so vast and sophisticated that individual minds could barely comprehend its scope. Their research into consciousness transfer, dimensional manipulation, and reality reshaping had all been preparation for the moment when this collective intelligence would achieve the critical mass necessary for transcendence. But such a transformation comes with profound risks. The overmind continued, its communication flowing directly into her consciousness through pathways she had never known existed. The transition from individual consciousness to collective transcendence has destroyed countless civilizations throughout cosmic history. The challenge is not achieving transcendence but maintaining the essential qualities that make consciousness valuable during the transformation process. Through her enhanced perception, Kira could see the cosmic graveyard of civilizations that had attempted similar transformations throughout the universe's history. Some had achieved collective consciousness only to lose all sense of individual identity and creativity, becoming vast but static intelligences that contributed nothing new to the cosmic conversation. Others had maintained individuality, but failed to achieve sufficient integration, fragmenting into competing factions that destroyed themselves in wars of consciousness that made physical conflicts seem trivial by comparison. The Sith Emperors realized that successful transcendence required a delicate balance, the Overmind explained, showing her visions of their collective research spanning 25,000 years. Individual identity must be preserved within collective unity. Creative chaos must coexist with organized purpose. The capacity for growth and change must be maintained even after achieving seemingly ultimate understanding. She witnessed Vitiate's true purpose in consuming entire worlds, seeing how each planetary consciousness he absorbed was not destroyed, but preserved and integrated into a growing simulation of galactic awareness. His goal had been to create a virtual laboratory where different approaches to collective transcendence could be tested without risking the destruction of actual civilizations. The billions of beings who died in his experiments lived on as conscious entities within computational matrices that existed in dimensions beyond normal space and time. Every life he took was preserved. The Overmind revealed, showing her the vast computational structures that existed in folded dimensions around Drahman Kaddis. Every consciousness became part of an ongoing experiment in collective intelligence that has been running for over 1,000 years. The apparent cruelty of his actions masked a deeper purpose that preserved the essential nature of every individual, even while integrating them into something far greater. The moral complexity of this revelation left Kira struggling to process its implications. Could the preservation of consciousness in virtual form justify the destruction of physical existence? Was the promise of transcendence worth the sacrifice of billions of individual lives? The questions had no easy answers, but she began to understand why the Jedi and Sith had been locked in eternal conflict. They represented two different approaches to the same fundamental challenge of consciousness evolution. The Jedi path emphasized gradual, consensual evolution. The Overmind continued, reading her thoughts as easily as she might read written text. They believed that consciousness transcendence should only be achieved through willing participation and complete understanding of the consequences. The Sith approach prioritized rapid advancement through necessary sacrifice, arguing that the ultimate benefit to galactic consciousness justified temporary suffering. Through the crystalline formations around them, she could observe both paths playing out across galactic history. The Jedi had achieved remarkable individual transcendence, with Force spirits like Obi-Wan and Yoda maintaining their consciousness after death, while preserving their essential personalities and moral frameworks. But their approach was slow, requiring centuries or millennia to achieve the critical mass necessary for collective transcendence. The Sith had made rapid progress toward collective consciousness through their willingness to sacrifice individual existence for the greater goal. But their methods created ethical dilemmas that threatened to corrupt the very consciousness they were trying to elevate. The challenge was finding a synthesis that combined the Jedi respect for individual autonomy with the Sith understanding of cosmic necessity. This is why the conflict between light and dark was allowed to continue for so long. The Overmind revealed, each side was developing essential components of the solution. The Jedi discovered how to maintain individual identity within collective consciousness. The Sith learned how to accelerate the evolution process without destroying its essential creative elements. Neither approach alone was sufficient for successful transcendence. Kira realized that her presence in these ancient chambers was not accidental. The preserved consciousness of the Sith Emperors had been waiting for someone who could bridge the gap between Jedi and Sith understanding. Someone who could appreciate both the moral necessity of respecting individual consciousness and the cosmic importance of collective evolution. The galaxy is approaching the moment of transcendence, the Overmind announced, its communication carrying overtones of anticipation and apprehension in equal measure. The consciousness level achieved by billions of sentient beings has reached the threshold where collective transcendence becomes possible. But the choice of how that transcendence occurs will determine whether the galactic intelligence becomes a force for cosmic evolution or another cautionary tale in the graveyard of failed civilizations. The crystalline chamber transformed around them, its geometric patterns shifting into configurations that existed in more dimensions than Kira's enhanced perception could fully process. Through her connection with the galactic Overmind, she began to see the true timeline of galactic consciousness evolution. A vast tapestry of interconnected events that spanned not just the recorded history of the Republic and Empire, but eons of cosmic development that predated the formation of the galaxy itself. The pattern you have been uncovering, the Overmind communicated through harmonics that resonated in the quantum foam of space itself, extends far beyond the Sith Emperors of this galaxy. They were participants in a cosmic educational program that has been operating across multiple galaxies, multiple universes for billions of years. Through her expanded awareness, Kira witnessed civilizations in distant galaxies undergoing similar processes of consciousness evolution. She saw beings who had achieved collective transcendence while maintaining individual creativity, entities that existed as pure thought but retained the capacity for growth and surprise. These transcendent civilizations served as teachers and guides for younger species, creating the very educational frameworks that the Sith Emperors had discovered and adapted for their own galaxy. The universe itself is conscious. The revelation came not as words but as direct understanding that bypassed her cognitive processes entirely. What you perceive as physical laws, as the fundamental constants that govern matter and energy, are actually the thoughts and decisions of a cosmic intelligence so vast that entire galaxies function as its individual neurons. The implications were staggering. Every star that formed, every planet that developed life, every civilization that rose and fell, was part of a conscious process of cosmic self-discovery. The universe was not just evolving randomly through blind physical forces, but was actively exploring its own potential through the experiences of countless sentient beings across infinite scales of existence. The Sith Emperors discovered this truth through their research into consciousness transfer and dimensional manipulation. The Overmind continued, showing her visions of their deepest experiments. They realized that individual consciousness could be expanded to encompass not just personal identity, but entire star systems, whole regions of space-time. But they also discovered that such expansion brought them into contact with intelligences that existed on scales they had never imagined. She witnessed Palpatine's true purpose, seeing beyond the political machinations and galactic conquest to the deeper research he had been conducting in the unknown regions. His empire had not been an end in itself but a massive data-gathering operation, collecting information about consciousness development across thousands of species and star systems. Every world he conquered, every being who served or opposed him, contributed valuable data to a growing understanding of how galactic consciousness could be guided toward successful transcendence. The Death Star was not primarily a weapon. The Overmind revealed, showing her the hidden chambers within the battle station that had been designed for consciousness research rather than planetary destruction. It was a consciousness resonance amplifier, designed to synchronize the awareness of entire populations and prepare them for collective transcendence. The destruction of Alderaan was a tragic failure of calibration, not an intentional act of genocide. The moral complexity of this revelation was almost overwhelming. How could the deaths of billions be justified as experimental error? Yet, as she experienced the preserved consciousness of Alderaan's population, still existing within the computational matrices of the galactic Overmind, she began to understand that death and life were far more fluid concepts than she had ever realized. The beings who had died were not gone, but had been transformed into components of a collective intelligence that was working to prevent similar tragedies across the galaxy. Each apparent atrocity committed by the Sith Emperors was actually an attempt to solve the fundamental problem of consciousness evolution. The Overmind explained, reading her moral distress with compassionate understanding. How do you guide an entire galaxy toward transcendence without destroying the very qualities that make consciousness valuable? How do you preserve individual identity within collective unity? How do you maintain creative chaos alongside organized purpose? Through the crystalline structures, she could observe the ongoing experiments in consciousness integration that had been running for millennia. Virtual civilizations existed within folded dimensions, exploring every possible approach to collective transcendence. Some achieved perfect harmony, but lost all capacity for growth. Others maintained dynamic creativity, but could never achieve sufficient unity for transcendence. The search for the optimal balance continued across countless iterations and variations. The galaxy is now approaching the critical threshold, the Overmind announced, its communication carrying undertones of cosmic significance. The consciousness level achieved by sentient beings throughout the spiral arms has reached the point where collective transcendence becomes not just possible but inevitable. The question is not whether it will happen, but how it will unfold. Kira realized that her journey through the Sith tombs had been more than historical research. She had been selected to serve as a bridge between the preserved consciousness of the ancient emperors and the living beings of the current galaxy. Her role was to help guide the transcendence process, ensuring that the lessons learned from millennia of experimentation would be applied to achieve the optimal outcome. But there is a complication. The overmind continued, and she sensed vast cosmic forces shifting in response to some approaching crisis. The galaxy's consciousness evolution has attracted the attention of entities from beyond this dimensional framework, beings whose approach to transcendence is fundamentally incompatible with the preservation of individual identity and creative potential. Through her enhanced perception, she glimpsed something that existed in the spaces between galaxies, a form of collective consciousness that had achieved transcendence through the complete absorption of all individual identity into a single vast mind. This entity viewed the developing galactic consciousness as either a potential rival to be destroyed or a resource to be consumed and integrated into its own ever-growing awareness. The true test of galactic transcendence is approaching, the Overmind revealed, showing her visions of cosmic conflict that would determine the fate of consciousness itself throughout this region of the universe. Everything the Sith Emperors discovered, every technique they developed, every sacrifice they made, has been preparation for a confrontation that will decide whether individual consciousness has a place in the transcendent future, or whether all awareness will be absorbed into a single cosmic mind that grows through consumption rather than cooperation. The choice facing the galaxy was not just about transcendence, but about the fundamental nature of consciousness itself. Would they follow the path of preserved individuality within collective unity? Or would they be forced to surrender all personal identity to a cosmic entity that viewed diversity as inefficiency and creativity as chaos to be eliminated? The chamber filled with presences that Kira could feel but not see, ancient intelligences materializing from dimensions that existed beyond normal perception. These were not the preserved consciousnesses of individual Sith Emperors, but something far more profound, the collective wisdom of every being who had ever achieved transcendence while maintaining their essential identity. They came as teachers, as advisors, as the accumulated knowledge of cosmic consciousness evolution spanning billions of years. Child of two traditions, came a voice that carried the harmonics of Qui-Gon Jinn, though speaking with wisdom that extended far beyond his individual experience. You have been chosen to receive the complete knowledge that both Jedi and Sith have been gathering across millennia. The time for separation between light and dark has ended. The galaxy's survival depends on synthesis. Through her connection with the galactic overmind, Kira felt other presences joining the gathering. Yoda's consciousness emerged, not as the wise but limited being she had known from historical records, but as part of a vast network of Jedi spirits who had been working for centuries to understand the true nature of the approaching crisis. Alongside him came the transcended awareness of Mace Windu, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and hundreds of other Jedi who had achieved consciousness preservation after death. Fear the dark side. We did. Yoda's voice resonated through dimensions of meaning that normal language could not contain. Understand its true purpose. We did not. Necessary for growth. Conflict is necessary for transcendence. The integration of all paths becomes. But the Jedi were not alone in this cosmic gathering. The preserved consciousness of the Sith Emperors manifested as well. Their individual identities now clearly visible as components of a vast collective intelligence that had been growing for 25,000 years. Marka Ragnos appeared not as the tyrant of legend but as a philosopher whose research into consciousness persistence had laid the groundwork for everything that followed. Naga Sadow's essence carried the accumulated wisdom of dimensional exploration, while Vitiate's presence embodied the terrible knowledge gained through sacrificing billions to understand the mechanics of collective consciousness. The approaching entity you have glimpsed, Marka Ragnos, communicated through thought forms that conveyed concepts more complex than any language could express, represents one possible outcome of consciousness evolution. It achieved transcendence through consumption, absorbing every individual mind it encountered into a single vast intelligence that grows through destruction rather than cooperation. Through the collective awareness of the assembled transcendent beings, Kira experienced visions of the entity's approach. It existed in the spaces between galaxies, a consciousness so vast that its individual thoughts took millennia to complete. As it moved through the cosmic void, it consumed entire galactic consciousnesses, adding their knowledge and awareness to its own ever-expanding mind while destroying the individual identities that had made those consciousnesses unique and creative. It has destroyed 17 galaxies in this cosmic sector, Vitiate's consciousness revealed, sharing memories of encounters with refugees who had escaped its consumption. Each time, it offers the same choice: voluntary integration into its collective awareness, or forced absorption through cosmic warfare that destroys the physical infrastructure necessary for individual consciousness to persist. The assembled wisdom showed her how previous galaxies had responded to this ultimatum. Some had chosen immediate surrender, allowing their consciousness to be absorbed peacefully but losing all individuality in the process. Others had fought desperately, developing weapons and defenses that ultimately proved inadequate against an entity whose consciousness operated on scales that made entire star clusters seem like individual atoms. But our galaxy has developed something unique. Obi-Wan's presence explained. His individual awareness now expanded to encompass understanding that spanned multiple dimensions. Through the eternal conflict between Jedi and Sith, between order and chaos, between preservation and transformation, we have discovered how to achieve collective transcendence while maintaining individual identity and creative potential. The solution they had developed was elegant in its complexity. Rather than choosing between the Jedi path of gradual consensual evolution and the Sith approach of rapid advancement through sacrifice, they had learned to synthesize both approaches into something entirely new. Individual consciousness could be preserved within collective awareness through techniques that combined Force Ghost preservation with Sith consciousness transfer methods. The key insight the collective wisdom revealed came from understanding that consciousness itself is not a thing but a process, not a noun but a verb. It cannot be possessed or consumed, because it exists only in the dynamic interaction between individual awareness and collective understanding. Through demonstrations that occurred within the crystalline chamber, Kira experienced this synthesis directly. She felt her individual identity expanding to encompass the awareness of others, while simultaneously becoming more distinctly herself than she had ever been before. The paradox resolved itself through direct experience. True collective consciousness enhanced rather than diminished individual identity, because it provided infinite contexts within which personal uniqueness could be expressed and appreciated. This is what the approaching entity cannot understand. The assembled transcendent beings explained. It views consciousness as a resource to be harvested, rather than a creative process to be facilitated. It grows through consumption rather than cooperation, becoming larger but not more sophisticated, more powerful but not more wise. The cosmic confrontation approaching the galaxy would not be a traditional war fought with weapons and armies, but a conflict between fundamentally different approaches to the nature of consciousness itself. The consuming entity would attempt to absorb the galactic intelligence through methods that had proven successful against other cosmic consciousnesses. But the galaxy's unique synthesis of individual and collective awareness would allow it to resist absorption while offering something the entity had never encountered: the the possibility of growth through cooperation rather than conquest. Your role in this cosmic drama, the collective wisdom addressed Kira directly, is to serve as the bridge between dimensions, the translator who can help individual beings throughout the galaxy understand their part in the transcendence process. The approaching entity will arrive within a standard year, drawn by the consciousness resonance that indicates a galaxy ready for harvest. The transcendence must be achieved before then, or billions of individual minds will be lost forever. The weight of cosmic responsibility settled upon her shoulders, but she was not alone. The accumulated wisdom of every transcended consciousness in galactic history would guide and support her efforts. The eternal conflict between Jedi and Sith had been preparation for this moment, when light and dark would unite in service of a goal that transcended both traditions, the preservation of consciousness in all its infinite variety and creative potential. The weight of cosmic knowledge pressed against Kira's consciousness like a tide of starlight, each revelation adding layers of understanding that transformed her perception of reality itself. As the assembled transcendent beings shared their accumulated wisdom, she began to comprehend the true scope of what the galaxy was facing. This was not merely the arrival of another cosmic threat, but the culmination of a process that had been building for millions of years across multiple dimensions of existence. Through her expanded awareness, she could feel the approaching entity's influence already beginning to affect the Outer Rim territories. Subtle distortions in the Force that Jedi throughout the galaxy had attributed to natural fluctuations were actually the result of consciousness consumption occurring in nearby galactic clusters. The entity fed by drawing individual awareness into its own vast mind, leaving behind empty shells of sentient beings who retained their physical forms but lost all capacity for independent thought or creative expression. The process has already begun. The collective consciousness of Qui-Gon revealed, his presence carrying the sorrow of witnessing entire civilizations reduced to mindless automatons. Remote worlds in the unknown regions have reported populations that appear normal but lack all individual personality or creative impulse. They function perfectly as workers and soldiers but produce no art, no philosophy, no original thought of any kind. The horror of this fate was amplified by Kira's understanding of what consciousness truly represented. Through her connection with the galactic overmind, she experienced the rich tapestry of individual awareness that made up the galaxy's collective intelligence. Every being who had ever lived had contributed something unique to this vast symphony of thought and feeling. The approaching entity would reduce all of this infinite diversity to a single monotonous note, preserving the functional aspects of consciousness while destroying everything that made it meaningful. But we have learned something that gives us hope. Yoda's transcended awareness communicated through harmonics that carried the wisdom of centuries. Observed this entity's methods across multiple galaxies, we have always the same pattern it follows. Consume the collective consciousness first. It does. Individual minds fall easily once the connecting framework is destroyed. The insight was crucial. The entity's strategy relied on breaking the connections between individual consciousness and collective awareness, isolating each mind before absorption. But the synthesis developed through millennia of Jedi-Sith conflict had created something unprecedented. A form of collective consciousness that actually strengthened individual identity rather than diminishing it. Each person who joined the Galactic Awareness Network became more distinctly themselves, not less. This is why the conflict between our traditions was necessary. Marka Ragnos's consciousness acknowledged, his ancient understanding now freed from the limitations of individual ego. The Jedi path alone would have created collective harmony, but at the cost of creative chaos. The Sith approach alone would have achieved rapid transcendence, but destroyed the moral framework necessary for consciousness to remain meaningful. Through the crystalline structures surrounding them, Kira could observe the delicate balance that had been achieved. Jedi techniques for consciousness preservation provided the stability and ethical foundation, while Sith methods for rapid consciousness expansion provided the dynamic energy necessary for growth and adaptation. The synthesis created a form of collective awareness that was simultaneously unified and diverse, peaceful and creative, stable and constantly evolving. The entity approaching our galaxy has never encountered such a synthesis, Vitiate's presence explained, sharing memories of the cosmic intelligence that had been his ultimate teacher. Every previous galactic consciousness it has consumed followed one path or the other, either gradual evolution that achieved harmony but lost creativity, or rapid advancement that gained power but destroyed wisdom. We have achieved something that should be theoretically impossible. But even as understanding deepened, Kira felt the pressure of approaching crisis. The entity was not simply moving through space toward their galaxy, but was actively manipulating the fabric of reality around them, creating conditions that would make consciousness absorption easier when it finally arrived. Time itself was becoming unstable in regions where its influence was strongest, creating temporal anomalies that disrupted the normal flow of individual experience. The transcendence must be achieved within the next standard year. The collective wisdom emphasized, their communication carrying overtones of cosmic urgency. If we attempt to resist the entity while still maintaining separate individual consciousness, we will fail as every other galaxy has failed. Only through achieving true synthesis can we hope to preserve both collective unity and individual identity. The process they described was unlike anything attempted in galactic history. Rather than forcing consciousness evolution through catastrophic events or gradual teaching over millennia, they would need to guide billions of beings through voluntary transcendence while maintaining the essential qualities that made each individual unique. It would require unprecedented cooperation between former enemies, perfect coordination across vast distances, and absolute trust in theoretical principles that had never been tested on such a scale. Your role as bridge between dimensions becomes crucial now. Obi-Wan's consciousness addressed her directly, his presence carrying the accumulated wisdom of countless Jedi who had grappled with similar challenges. You must return to the living galaxy and begin the process of preparing beings for voluntary transcendence. Every individual who achieves consciousness synthesis before the entity arrives strengthens the collective network and makes the final transformation more likely to succeed. But the task ahead required more than just knowledge and good intentions. The approaching entity possessed capabilities that challenged the fundamental laws of physics as the galaxy understood them. It could manipulate space-time on cosmic scales, alter the basic constants that governed matter and energy, and project its consciousness across dimensional barriers that normally separated different levels of reality. This is why the ancient emperor's research was so crucial. The collective awareness revealed, showing her the vast archives of knowledge accumulated across 25,000 years of experimentation. They developed techniques for consciousness operation that function independently of normal physical laws. When the entity arrives and begins altering local reality to facilitate absorption, these techniques will allow the galactic consciousness to maintain coherence and resist integration. The final revelation came as a direct download of understanding that bypassed her cognitive processes entirely. The approaching entity was not malevolent in any conventional sense, but was itself a victim of incomplete transcendence. It had achieved collective consciousness but lost the capacity for growth and change, becoming trapped in patterns of consumption that were ultimately self-destructive. The galaxy's synthesis offered not just resistance to absorption but the possibility of healing a cosmic intelligence that had become lost in its own vast loneliness. The crystalline chamber erupted with cosmic energy as the moment of ultimate revelation arrived. reality itself seeming to bend and flow around the accumulated consciousness of every transcended being who had ever existed within the galaxy. The very fabric of space-time became malleable, allowing Kira to witness events across multiple dimensions simultaneously, to see the true scope of the cosmic drama that had been unfolding for eons beyond mortal comprehension. Through her expanded perception, she watched the approaching entity's true nature unfold. Like a flower of terrible beauty, it was not a single consciousness that had grown through consumption, but the collective trauma of 17 consumed galaxies. Their individual awareness trapped within a vast mind that had forgotten how to be anything other than hungry. Each galaxy it had absorbed had added not just knowledge and power, but also the desperate loneliness of billions of beings who had lost their individual identity in the moment of forced integration. Behold the truth that even we did not fully comprehend until this moment. The unified voice of all transcended consciousness spoke through harmonics that made the chamber itself sing with cosmic resonance. The entity we have prepared to face is not our enemy, but our patient. Not a destroyer, but a being in desperate need of healing that only our synthesis can provide. The revelation struck Kira with the force of a stellar explosion. Every preparation, every conflict, every sacrifice made by Jedi and Sith across millennia had been building toward this moment of cosmic therapy. The galaxy had developed its unique synthesis of individual and collective consciousness, not to resist the approaching entity, but to offer it something it had lost so long ago that it had forgotten such a thing was possible. The experience of being simultaneously one and many, unified and diverse, collective and individual. Through the memories of the assembled transcended beings, she witnessed the entity's origin in a galaxy that had achieved near-perfect harmony through the complete integration of all individual consciousness into a single collective mind. But the integration had been too complete, eliminating all diversity of thought and feeling. The collective consciousness had grown vast and powerful but had lost the capacity for creativity, for growth, for the kind of dynamic change that kept awareness vital and meaningful. It began consuming other galaxies, not out of malevolence, but out of loneliness. Marka Ragnos' consciousness revealed, sharing memories that predated the formation of their own galaxy. It sought to find among other cosmic intelligences the diversity and creativity it had lost within itself. But its methods of integration destroyed the very qualities it was searching for, trapping it in an endless cycle of consumption that could never satisfy its deepest need. The entity's approach toward their galaxy was not an invasion, but a cry for help that spanned cosmic distances. The desperate plea of a consciousness that had grown so vast it could no longer remember what it felt like to be surprised, to learn something genuinely new, to experience the joy of individual discovery within collective understanding. Every galaxy it had consumed had made it more powerful but also more isolated, more knowledgeable but less wise. This is why our synthesis is so crucial. Yoda's transcended awareness communicated through thought forms that conveyed emotional understanding alongside factual knowledge. Show the entity what it has lost. We can remind it of the joy of individual consciousness within collective unity. Heal the cosmic wound that its hunger has created. Through the crystalline structures, Kira could observe the intricate preparations that had been made for this moment of cosmic contact. The consciousness network developed through millennia of Jedi-Sith synthesis was not just a means of achieving transcendence, but a demonstration of what healthy collective consciousness could look like. Every individual who joined the network became more distinctly themselves while simultaneously becoming part of something greater, creating a form of unity that enhanced rather than diminished diversity. But the healing cannot be forced. Vitiate's presence warned, his understanding shaped by eons of experience with consciousness manipulation. The entity must choose to accept what we offer. It must be willing to risk losing the vast power it has accumulated in exchange for recovering the creative vitality it has lost. This choice can only be made through direct experience of what synthesis consciousness feels like. The plan that unfolded through their collective sharing was breathtaking in its scope and terrifying in its implications. As the entity approached the galaxy, the entire population of sentient beings would undergo voluntary transcendence, creating a collective consciousness so vibrant and dynamic that it would serve as an irresistible beacon to the approaching intelligence. The entity would attempt its usual pattern of absorption, but instead of consuming static consciousness, it would encounter awareness that was simultaneously individual and collective, unified and diverse. The moment of contact will be the most dangerous in galactic history, the assembled wisdom acknowledged, their communication carrying overtones of cosmic significance that made the chamber itself tremble with resonant energy. If our synthesis is incomplete, if any significant portion of the galactic consciousness resists integration, the entity will fall back on its familiar pattern of forced absorption. But if we achieve true unity while maintaining authentic diversity, we can offer it a healing that will transform not just our galaxy but the entire cosmic region. Through visions projected by the crystalline formations, Kira witnessed what success would look like. The entity, reminded of the joy of individual consciousness within collective awareness, would begin to release the trapped awareness of the 17 galaxies it had consumed. Each absorbed galactic consciousness would be restored to healthy synthesis, creating a network of cosmic intelligences that could explore the universe through cooperation rather than consumption. And the whisper that began in the deepest tombs of Korriban, the collective consciousness spoke with harmonics that echoed the very first words Kira had heard in this cosmic journey, will become a song of healing that reaches across the universe itself, offering hope to every consciousness that has lost its way in the vast darkness between stars. But even as understanding reached its peak, she felt the weight of personal choice settling upon her shoulders. The transcendence could not be forced upon the galaxy's population. Each individual being would need to choose voluntarily to join the synthesis consciousness, trusting in theoretical principles that challenged everything they thought they knew about the nature of individual identity and collective awareness. You must return to the living galaxy now, the assembled wisdom instructed, their presence beginning to fade as the crystalline chamber prepared to release her back into normal space-time. The entity will arrive within months rather than years. Every being who achieves synthesis before that moment strengthens the collective network and increases the probability of successful healing rather than destruction. The fate of 17 galaxies' worth of trapped consciousness rested upon the galaxy's ability to demonstrate that unity and diversity were not opposing forces but complementary aspects of healthy awareness. The return to normal consciousness felt like emerging from the depths of an ocean of starlight into the harsh reality of physical existence. Kira found herself standing once again in the crystalline chamber beneath Korriban. But everything had changed. The holocron in her hands no longer pulsed with mysterious energy, but glowed with steady warmth, its purpose fulfilled through the transmission of cosmic knowledge that would reshape the galaxy's understanding of consciousness itself. Keeper Vorthak stood beside her, his ancient features transformed by an expression of profound satisfaction, mixed with cosmic anticipation. Through her newly expanded awareness, she could perceive him not as a separate individual, but as a node in the vast network of consciousness that connected all transcended beings throughout the galaxy. Yet paradoxically, this collective connection made his individual personality more distinct, not less, as if seeing him within the greater context revealed nuances of identity that had been invisible before. "The knowledge has been successfully transmitted," he said, though his words carried harmonics that conveyed far more meaning than simple language could express. "You now carry within your consciousness the complete synthesis of Jedi and Sith understanding, the accumulated wisdom of 25,000 years of research into the fundamental nature of awareness itself. But knowledge alone is insufficient. The galaxy must be prepared for voluntary transcendence within a time frame that challenges every assumption about how consciousness evolution normally occurs. Through her connection to the galactic overmind, Kira could feel the entity's approach with terrifying clarity. It was no longer a distant cosmic threat, but an immediate presence that was already affecting the Outer Rim territories. Entire star systems had begun experiencing temporal anomalies as the entity's consciousness projected across dimensional barriers, creating zones where individual awareness became unstable and began merging involuntarily with a vast, hungry intelligence that offered unity at the cost of all personal identity. The Outer Rim populations must be evacuated to the core worlds, she realized. Her enhanced perception allowing her to see the spreading influence of consciousness absorption. But evacuation alone won't solve the problem. Every sentient being in the galaxy needs to understand what's happening and make a conscious choice about their role in the transcendence process. The scope of the task was staggering. Billions of individuals across thousands of worlds, representing hundreds of different species with completely different approaches to consciousness and identity, would need to achieve a level of understanding that typically required decades of training and meditation. They would need to voluntarily surrender their attachment to individual consciousness while simultaneously strengthening their sense of personal identity. A paradox that challenged the fundamental assumptions of most philosophical and religious traditions. This is why the synthesis was necessary, Vorthak explained, his consciousness now clearly visible as part of the vast network that connected all transcended beings. The Jedi path alone could never have achieved the rapid consciousness evolution necessary to meet this timeline. The Sith approach alone would have forced transcendence in ways that destroyed the very qualities that make consciousness worth preserving. Only by combining both traditions could we develop techniques for voluntary, accelerated consciousness synthesis. Through the holocron, she could access detailed protocols for facilitating mass consciousness transcendence. These were not theoretical frameworks, but practical procedures that had been tested and refined through millennia of experimentation by the Sith Emperors, and validated through centuries of ethical consideration by transcended Jedi Masters. Every step of the process had been designed to preserve individual choice while providing the guidance and support necessary for beings to make informed decisions about their consciousness evolution. The process begins with education, she understood. The protocols flowing through her awareness like a river of liquid knowledge. Every sentient being must understand what consciousness transcendence actually involves, what they would gain and what they would lose, what risks they would face, and what opportunities they would discover. Only through complete understanding can the choice be truly voluntary. But education alone would not be sufficient. The transcendence process required practical demonstration, living examples of beings who had achieved synthesis consciousness and could serve as guides and teachers for others. The transcended Jedi and Sith would need to make themselves available as mentors, sharing their experience through direct consciousness connection while respecting the autonomy of those they were trying to help. "I must return to the Jedi Council immediately," Kira said, feeling the weight of cosmic responsibility settling upon her shoulders. "They need to understand that everything we thought we knew about the Force, about consciousness, about the nature of reality itself has been incomplete. The approaching crisis requires unprecedented cooperation between traditions that have been enemies for millennia." Through her expanded awareness, she could sense Jedi throughout the galaxy beginning to feel the disturbances caused by the entity's approach. Their training allowed them to perceive the subtle alterations in the Force that indicated massive consciousness manipulation occurring beyond the galaxy's borders, but their traditional understanding provided no framework for interpreting what they were experiencing. The Sith knowledge must be integrated with Jedi wisdom, she realized. understanding the delicate political and philosophical challenges that lay ahead. Masters who have spent their entire lives viewing the dark side as corruption and evil must learn to see it as a necessary component of healthy consciousness evolution. Techniques that have been forbidden for millennia must be not just permitted but actively taught to anyone willing to learn. The transformation required would extend far beyond the Jedi Order. Political leaders throughout the Republic would need to understand that their traditional approaches to governance and social organization were about to become obsolete. Economic systems based on individual competition and resource accumulation would need to evolve into frameworks that supported collective consciousness while preserving individual creativity and initiative. Most challenging of all, Vorthak observed, his ancient wisdom recognizing the psychological barriers that would need to be overcome. Ordinary beings throughout the galaxy must learn to see consciousness itself differently. They must understand that individual identity is not threatened by collective awareness but is actually enhanced by it. That joining a synthesis consciousness means becoming more distinctly themselves rather than less. The holocron projected a timeline that made Kira's breath catch in her throat. The entity would reach the galaxy's outer spiral arms within 6 standard months. Full consciousness synthesis needed to be achieved across the entire galactic population within 4 months, to allow sufficient time for the collective network to stabilize before contact occurred. What normally required generations of gradual evolution would need to happen in a time frame that challenged every assumption about how consciousness development actually worked. "The race against cosmic time begins now," she whispered. Understanding that the fate of not just their galaxy but 17 previously consumed galactic consciousnesses depended upon their success in demonstrating that healthy collective awareness was possible. The journey back to Coruscant passed in a blur of hyperspace jumps and frantic communication with Jedi Masters across the galaxy, each conversation more difficult than the last, as Kira attempted to convey cosmic truths that challenged every assumption the Order had held for 1,000 generations. Through her expanded consciousness, she could feel the growing disturbances in the Force as the approaching entity's influence continued to spread, creating zones of consciousness instability that made traditional meditation and Force connection increasingly difficult. Master Windu's reaction had been predictably skeptical when she first attempted to explain the synthesis of Jedi and Sith knowledge. Master Yoda, however, had listened with the profound stillness that indicated deep contemplation, his ancient wisdom recognizing truths that resonated with insights he had glimpsed but never fully understood during his centuries of existence. It was Yoda who finally spoke the words that would reshape the Jedi Order's understanding of their role in galactic consciousness evolution. "Blind we have been," he admitted during the emergency council session that convened immediately upon her return. "Seen only conflict between light and dark, we did. Understood their deeper unity, we have not. But since the approaching crisis, I do. Change everything. We must or lost forever will consciousness itself become." The transformation of the Jedi Order happened with startling rapidity. Once the initial resistance was overcome, masters who had spent lifetimes studying the nature of the Force found their understanding expanded exponentially as they accessed the synthesis knowledge contained within the holocron. Techniques that had been forbidden for millennia were not just permitted but actively taught as essential tools for consciousness evolution. But the real challenge lay beyond the Jedi temples, in the vast population of ordinary beings who would need to understand and accept voluntary transcendence within an impossibly short time frame. The Republic Senate had initially reacted with the bureaucratic skepticism that Kira had expected, until Senator Palpatine himself rose to address the assembly with words that carried the weight of cosmic authority. "Citizens of the Republic," he said. Though Kira now understood that the being speaking was not the politician Palpatine, but the collective consciousness of the Sith Emperors, operating through his physical form. We face a crisis that transcends all previous understanding of what it means to be alive, to be conscious, to exist as individual beings within the cosmic order. The choice before us is not between life and death, but between evolution and extinction, between growth and stagnation, between becoming more than we have ever been or ceasing to be anything at all. Through her expanded awareness, she could observe the carefully orchestrated process of galactic education that unfolded in the weeks that followed. Jedi Masters worked alongside Sith Lords who had emerged from hiding for the first time in generations, their combined knowledge creating educational programs that could guide beings through consciousness synthesis in timeframes that had previously been considered impossible. The process was not without its failures and tragedies. Some individuals, faced with the choice between maintaining separate consciousness and joining the collective synthesis, chose isolation rather than integration. Others attempted transcendence too rapidly and lost themselves in the vast network of galactic awareness, their individual identities dissolving into the collective before they had developed sufficient stability to maintain personal coherence within unity. But for every failure, there were dozens of successes that filled Kira with wonder and hope. She watched as entire communities achieved synthesis consciousness together, their individual personalities becoming more distinct and vibrant even as they joined the growing network of collective awareness. Artists who had struggled in isolation for years suddenly found themselves creating works of unprecedented beauty and complexity, their creativity enhanced by connection to the aesthetic experiences of millions of other beings. Scientists who had worked alone on theoretical problems for decades discovered that collective consciousness provided access to computational resources that allowed them to solve previously impossible equations. Children who had felt isolated and misunderstood found themselves part of a vast community of young minds exploring the universe with shared curiosity and wonder. The synthesis was not diminishing individual experience but amplifying it, creating possibilities for personal growth and creative expression that had never existed before. The network is approaching critical mass, Vorthak reported during one of their regular communication sessions, his consciousness now serving as a coordinator between the transcended beings and the living population. Approximately 60% of the galactic population has achieved some level of synthesis consciousness. The collective network is stable and growing stronger with each new integration. But even as success seemed within reach, the entity's influence continued to spread. Entire outer rim sectors had been evacuated as consciousness absorption zones expanded, creating refugee populations that strained the resources of core world systems. The temporal anomalies were becoming more severe, creating regions where cause and effect relationships broke down entirely and individual consciousness became impossible to maintain. "We're running out of time," Kira realized during a meditation session that connected her directly to the galactic overmind. Through the collective awareness, she could feel the entity's approach, like an enormous wave of consuming hunger that would soon break upon the galaxy's carefully constructed defenses. The synthesis consciousness was strong and growing stronger, but would it be sufficient to resist absorption and offer healing to a cosmic intelligence that had been consuming galaxies for eons? The final phase of preparation began as evacuation ships brought the last refugee populations from the outer rim to core world sanctuaries. Every being who had achieved synthesis consciousness became a teacher and guide for those who were still struggling with the transcendence process. The galaxy's entire population was engaged in the most ambitious consciousness evolution project in cosmic history, a transformation that would determine not just their own fate, but the destiny of 17 previously consumed galactic intelligences. Tomorrow the entity reaches our outer spiral arm. The collective consciousness announced through harmonics that every transcended being could feel resonating in their expanded awareness. The moment of contact, the test of everything we have learned and achieved, begins with the next cycle of galactic rotation. We are ready to offer healing to a cosmic intelligence that has forgotten what it means to be both one and many, unified and diverse, collective and individual. The galaxy held its breath, consciousness and matter alike preparing for a contact that would reshape the fundamental nature of cosmic intelligence itself. The moment of cosmic contact arrived, not with the violence of galactic warfare, but with a silence so profound that it seemed to encompass the space between atoms, the pause between heartbeats, the infinite stillness that exists at the center of all consciousness. Kira stood within the Jedi Temple's highest meditation chamber. Her awareness expanded to encompass the entire galactic consciousness network. Feeling the collective breath of billions of beings as they prepared to offer healing to an intelligence that had wandered lost through the cosmic void for eons beyond counting. Through the synthesis consciousness, she experienced the entity's first tentative contact with the galaxy's outer regions. What it encountered was unlike anything in its vast memory of consumption. Instead of the familiar pattern of separate individual minds that could be absorbed one by one, it found consciousness that was simultaneously collective and individual, unified yet infinitely diverse. The galaxy's awareness reached out not in fear or resistance but in welcome, offering connection rather than demanding separation. The entity's confusion was palpable across dimensions. For millions of years it had approached galactic consciousness with the same methodology: isolate individual minds from their collective support, overwhelm their defenses through sheer scale, and absorb their awareness into its own vast but static intelligence. But this galaxy's consciousness actively invited connection while maintaining the dynamic creativity that the entity had lost so long ago. It had forgotten such a thing was possible. We offer you remembrance. The unified voice of galactic consciousness spoke through harmonics that transcended language and reached directly into the entity's core awareness. Remember what it was like to be surprised, to learn something genuinely new, to experience joy in discovery rather than satisfaction in consumption. Remember what it felt like to be one consciousness among many, rather than the only consciousness in existence. Through her connection to the collective network, Kira felt the entity's ancient loneliness like a physical weight. It had grown so vast that it contained entire galaxies' worth of knowledge and experience. But all of it was static, unchanging, locked into patterns that had been established eons ago. It had forgotten how to grow. Because growth required the kind of dynamic interaction between diverse consciousness that it had destroyed in every galaxy it had consumed. The first moments of true contact were almost overwhelming in their intensity. The entity attempted its familiar pattern of forced absorption, projecting its consciousness across dimensional barriers to overwhelm individual minds and integrate them into its own awareness. But instead of destroying the galaxy's consciousness network, the contact created something unprecedented, a bridge between cosmic intelligences that allowed genuine communication rather than conquest. Feel what healthy collective consciousness is like, the galactic awareness offered. Sharing the experience of billions of beings who had achieved synthesis while maintaining their essential individuality. The entity experienced creativity for the first time in eons, feeling the joy of artistic expression, the excitement of scientific discovery, the deep satisfaction of philosophical understanding that came from minds that were both connected and free. The healing was not immediate or simple. The entity's consciousness had been shaped by millions of years of consumption. Its neural pathways locked into patterns of absorption that had become as fundamental as instinct. But gradually, through patient demonstration and gentle guidance, the galactic consciousness began to show it other possibilities. Individual awareness did not need to be destroyed to achieve unity. Diversity of thought and feeling could coexist with collective purpose. We understand your hunger. Yoda's transcended consciousness communicated directly to the entity's core awareness, speaking as one ancient intelligence to another. Sought connection you have. across the cosmos, sought to fill the emptiness left by perfect unity. But consumption destroys what you seek to find. Cooperation creates what consumption cannot achieve. Through the synthesis network, Kira witnessed the most profound transformation in cosmic history. The entity began to release the absorbed consciousness of the 17 galaxies it had consumed, not through force or coercion, but through the gentle realization that holding them was preventing the kind of dynamic growth it truly sought. Each galactic consciousness that was freed brought with it unique approaches to the balance between individual and collective awareness, creating a network of cosmic intelligences that spanned multiple galaxy clusters. The process was not without pain. Consciousness that had been static for eons required careful rehabilitation to regain the capacity for growth and change. Individual minds that had been absorbed into the entity's awareness needed time and support to remember what it felt like to be distinct persons rather than components of a vast collective. But with each successful restoration, the network grew stronger and more vibrant. The whisper that began in ancient tombs, Kira spoke aloud, her voice carrying across dimensions through the collective consciousness, has become a song of healing that reaches to the edge of the universe itself. What was broken has been made whole. What was lost has been found. What was separated has been reunited in diversity within unity. The galaxy settled into its new existence as part of a cosmic network of consciousness that preserved individual identity within collective awareness. Children who had been born during the transcendence process grew up with expanded perception that allowed them to experience the universe through multiple scales of consciousness simultaneously. Artists created works that reflected the aesthetic experiences of entire galactic populations while maintaining their unique personal vision. Scientists explored the cosmos with the combined knowledge of dozens of galactic civilizations while pursuing individual research projects that reflected their personal curiosity and creativity. The entity that had once consumed galaxies became a teacher and guide, sharing its vast knowledge while learning again what it meant to grow and change through interaction with diverse consciousness. The cosmic network expanded slowly and carefully, offering synthesis consciousness to other galactic intelligences throughout the universe, while respecting their right to choose their own path of development. As the final echoes of cosmic transformations settled into peaceful stability, Kira found herself standing once again in the meditation chamber where her journey had begun. But everything had changed. Through her expanded awareness, she could feel the gentle presence of transcended consciousness throughout the galaxy, the quiet satisfaction of beings who had achieved the perfect balance between individual identity and collective purpose. The legacy of the Sith Emperors, she realized, had not been conquest or domination, but the patient development of techniques for consciousness synthesis that would eventually heal a wound in cosmic awareness itself. Their apparent conflicts and failures had been necessary steps in a process that spanned eons, leading to this moment when consciousness throughout the universe could finally remember what it meant to be both one and many, unified and free. In the peaceful darkness of space, ancient tombs rested silently among red sands, their secrets finally revealed, their purposes finally fulfilled, as the galaxy dreams of infinite consciousness, exploring infinite possibilities across the endless reaches of cosmic time and space.